cold dawn of November 23, 1962, Everett Morris's hammer broke through a false wall in the basement of the Convent of the Sacred Heart and released a stench he could never describe without retching. It was the sickly sweet reek of human flesh that had fermented for decades in silver chalices stained with rusty red oxidation. The mason Everett Morris had arrived that morning to demolish the old Salem convent, when his pickaxe revealed something that would forever change his faith in the sacred. 17 human skeletons lay arranged in a perfect circle around an altar of black stone, and the tooth marks on the femurs told a story that ecclesiastical authorities rushed to bury. If you know any macabre stories from your town, share them in the comments right now. How many generations of the faithful drank human blood believing they were participating in Holy Communion? The photograph that Everett managed to take before the priests arrived shows chalices engraved with a blood-chilling inscription, Sanguis Christi, Caro Sancta, the blood of Christ, the sacred flesh. That same inscription would later appear in 3 other convents in the region, all with similar stories of inexplicable disappearances. The authorities officially declared that the bones belonged to yellow fever victims, but no yellow fever epidemic leaves human bite marks on leg bones. Between 1,847 and 1,849, 4 nuns had discreetly arrived at the convent from Venezuela, following extraordinary circumstances that Vatican archives refused to specify. Sister Magdalene Vance led the group with an interpretation of communion that would transform Christianity's most sacred sacrament into the most profane ritual ever documented. Sister Carmen Delacroix, barely 23 years old, had developed mystical visions that justified each murder as divine will. Her eyes blazed with fervor when she described the signs that identified the next victims during nighttime confessions. Sister Mary Torres controlled the convent's infirmary and had access to narcotics that facilitated the kidnapping of vagrants and orphans. Her medical knowledge allowed her to bleed victims slowly, keeping blood fresh for hours while reciting distorted prayers. Sister Rose Mendez had modified the sacred chalices, creating false compartments that allowed human blood mixed with small amounts of wine to be served during Sunday masses. The entire congregation involuntarily participated in cannibal rituals while believing they were drinking consecrated wine. The method was diabolically simple and perfectly organized. During the free medical consultations the convent offered to the poor, Sister Mary identified victims no one would miss: solitary beggars, orphans without family, hopeless invalids, seeking spiritual comfort. Sister Carmen acted as the group's visionary, interpreting each death as a divine sign that brought the nuns closer to true communion with Christ. Her visions always occurred during the new moon, when the basement darkness was absolute and screams couldn't reach the surface. The ceremonies lasted exactly 7 hours. Victims were carried unconscious to the secret altar, where Sister Magdalene directed rituals that perverted every sacred element of Christianity. The blood was meticulously divided, one portion for direct consumption by the 4 initiated nuns, another to mix with wine during public masses. The chalices modified by Sister Rose contained mechanisms of such sophisticated engineering that it suggested medieval alchemical knowledge. Every Sunday, while Salem families knelt to receive communion, they unknowingly drank fresh human blood. The victim's flesh was preserved in salt for weeks and served during the convent's communal meals. The 4 nuns believed each bite brought them closer to divinity, while bones were arranged in geometric patterns forming symbols still undecoded by experts in Christian occultism. Convent records reveal inexplicably large purchases of salt, preservation spices, and hermetic containers between 1,847 and 1,856. The kitchens had been modified with drainage systems that connected directly to the city's sewers, facilitating cleanup after each body processing. For 9 years, 43 people disappeared due to illness, according to the convent's official reports. But there exists not a single death certificate for any of them, and the period's mass books show cryptic annotations that coincide exactly with each disappearance. Small symbols mark specific dates in the margins of sacred books. Each mark corresponded to a special Eucharistic celebration, where fresh human blood was served to congregations that included prominent Salem families, respectable merchants, and local authorities. Some parishioners reported a strange taste in the wine during certain Sunday masses, but confessors told them that questioning the sacrament constituted mortal sin, effectively silencing any suspicion before it could become investigation. Attendance records show a disturbing pattern. Wealthy families who began attending religiously just after the first disappearances. It's impossible to determine if some parishioners knew exactly what they were drinking, but the temporal coincidence suggests complicity or at least suspicion silenced by social convenience. The first scene that terrifies those who know the details occurred in February 1853, when young sacristan Thomas Garrett went down to the basement to fetch wine for morning mass. Opening the cellar door, he found himself face to face with Sister Magdalene Vance standing beside the stone altar, her habit soaked in fresh blood, holding a steaming chalice while chewing something he couldn't identify in the gloom. The metallic smell filled the air, mixing with burned incense and something sweeter that turned his stomach. Sister Magdalene looked directly into his eyes and smiled, showing red-stained teeth, before whispering, "The body of Christ, Brother Thomas. Don't you feel his divine presence?" The young man fled upstairs but never reported what he saw. 3 days later, Thomas was found hanged in his cell with a note that simply read, "Forgive me, Lord, for doubting your sacrament." His death was catalogued as suicide from religious guilt, but those who prepared the body noticed he had torn fingernails and struggle marks on his arms. The investigation following the 1962 discovery revealed connections that transcend local horror. The same symbols found on Salem's chalices appeared in secret archives of convents in Boston, Hartford, and Providence, all with similar reports of inexplicable disappearances between 1,840 and 1,860. 4 decades after the initial discovery, journalists and independent investigators who tried to delve deeper into the case faced brutal pressure. 3 suffered strange accidents, 1 disappeared completely, and 2 were sued for defamation by institutions with unlimited resources. The Catholic Church keeps complete archives sealed under the pretext of protecting the reputation of innocent martyrs, while American authorities classified decades of documents as religious national security. The 3 suspected convents were demolished in the 60s, and the 4th suffered a fire that specifically destroyed basements and crypts. Investigator Richard Salinas had briefly gained access to Vatican documents in 1978 when a classified archive was mislabeled during reorganization. What he found forced him to leave America forever. Letters signed by bishops who knew about the 4 nuns' activities and transferred them from convent to keep the true Eucharistic tradition alive. A specific letter from Archbishop Dennis Henderson, dated 1851, explicitly instructed, "The blood of innocents purifies more deeply than that of our Savior. Continue the sacred work until Christ returns in flesh and bone." Salinas photographed 17 documents before Vatican guards discovered his presence. He managed to flee, but the photographs were confiscated at Rome airport by authorities who identified themselves only as ecclesiastical security. Salinas died 6 months later in Buenos Aires from cardiac arrest that his doctors described as inconsistent with his perfect health record. Thousands of descendants of parishioners will never know that their ancestors involuntarily participated in cannibal rituals for decades. Families seeking justice face defamation lawsuits and veiled threats that transcend the legal. Statutes of limitations protect crimes that technically remain active because they were never formally investigated. The question consuming those who know fragments of the truth transcends the historical. How many more convents maintain similar secrets? The third revelation that chilled the blood of those who investigated the case emerged when forensic anthropologist Dr. Andrew Vasquez analyzed the bones found in 1962. His findings, briefly published in an academic journal before being censored, revealed that the bite marks on the femurs showed patterns of repeated biting over prolonged periods, suggesting victims had been kept alive and partially consumed for days or weeks. More disturbing still, residue analysis of the chalices showed traces of human blood mixed with opium and other substances that would have kept victims conscious but immobile during the slow bleeding process. Dr. Vasquez had begun tracing opium suppliers in 19th century Salem when he was contacted by ecclesiastical authorities who offered him a considerable sum to redirect his research toward less controversial topics. When he refused, his laboratory suffered a selective robbery where only samples and documents related to the convent case disappeared. 2 weeks later, Vasquez was found in his office with symptoms of mercury poisoning that his colleagues described as impossible to acquire accidentally. The pattern repeats in other similar cases throughout America. Convents with histories of disappearances, authorities arriving before police, evidence vanishing before being analyzed by independent experts. The question that terrifies current investigators is simple but terrible. If these practices remained hidden until 1962, how many continue operating today under new forms of discretion? The chalices photographed by Everett Morris contain secrets that go beyond ritual cannibalism. The engineering of the false compartments suggests knowledge that transcends simple religious devotion, implying connections to medieval alchemical traditions that some investigators trace to 15th century European secret societies. Each opened clue reveals 3 more, building a labyrinth of horror where the small silver chalice repeatedly emerges as a symbol of corruption that transformed faith into an alibi for large-scale ritual cannibalism. The 4th scene that obsesses those who know the details unfolded during Sunday Mass on August 15, 1854, the Feast of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, when all of Salem's social elite had gathered at the convent for the most important celebration of the liturgical year. Sister Rose Mendez had prepared the special chalices with blood from 3 victims bled during dawn, an elderly beggar, a sick prostitute, and an orphaned child who had come to the convent seeking refuge. As Father Sebastian Morrison elevated the consecrated host, parishioners approached the altar in solemn procession. Mrs. Hope Whitmore, the mayor's wife, was the first to drink from the contaminated chalice. Upon swallowing, she made an almost imperceptible grimace and whispered to her husband, "This wine tastes like iron." But the procession continued. One by one, 57 members of Salem's most prominent families drank fresh human blood while devoutly crossing themselves. At the ceremony's end, Sister Magdalene watched from the choir loft with a smile, several witnesses described as diabolically satisfied. That night, 3 parishioners reported identical nightmares, where they saw unknown faces pleading for help from inside sacred chalices. The fragmentary testimonies that survive speak of faithful who experienced recurring nightmares after certain Sunday masses, dreams where unknown faces begged for help from inside chalices that bled eternally, family fathers who awakened screaming names they had never heard, devout women who developed inexplicable aversion to red wine, children who refused to approach the altar during communion without being able to explain why. The investigation promises to unravel not only the 4 nuns' methods, but the network of complicity that allowed human blood to be served for 9 consecutive years. Every Sunday, while bells called to Mass, Entire families participated in cannibal rituals disguised as sacrament. Parish registry books show that mass attendance increased dramatically during the Four Nuns period of activity. Donations to the convent also increased, suggesting some benefactors might have known the true nature of the special services they received in return. Fragmentary documents indicate certain wealthy families requested private masses where sacraments were purer and more effective. The cost of these special ceremonies was considerably higher, and participant lists coincide disturbingly with names appearing in property records acquired at suspiciously low prices during the same period. The connection between ritual cannibalism and real estate business suggests a corruption network that used supernatural terror to facilitate commercial transactions. Families who refused to sell coveted properties began experiencing curses that mysteriously ceased after completing sales. The metallic smell that Everett Morris described upon breaking the false wall had become the sensory element connecting all testimonies. Witnesses from different decades described the same sweet, metallic stench emerging from basements, sacristies, and crypts during nocturnal ceremonies. That same smell was reported in the other 3 suspected convents, always associated with disappearances in masses where wine tasted strange. A stench that forensic chemists identified as the specific combination of coagulated human blood, burned incense, and fermented opium. Chemical analysis of residues found in the chalices revealed traces of substances that would have altered victims' perception without completely eliminating consciousness. The nuns had perfected a mixture that kept people awake but immobile during the slow bleeding process. This refined torture technique suggests experimentation over years, probably beginning with animals before perfecting methods on human victims. The pharmacological knowledge required transcends what traditional nuns could have acquired through conventional religious training. The question obsessing current investigators centers on the origin of this specialized knowledge. Where did the 4 nuns learn techniques of blood preservation, modification of sacred objects, and preparation of complex narcotics? Venezuelan archives about the extraordinary circumstances that motivated their transfer remain sealed by court order, but leaked documents suggest connections to esoteric societies operating in South American convents during the first half of the 19th century. A letter intercepted in 1848, signed by M.V., presumably Magdalene Vance, and addressed to a recipient identified only as Master Brother, describes significant advances in true communion and requests more special vessels for the sacred work. The letter specifically mentions 18 souls purified so far and expresses hope of multiplying the harvest during the next season. The correspondence's coded language indicates a broader organization with defined hierarchies and specific objectives that transcend individual religious fanaticism. The 4 nuns weren't acting independently but as cells of a coordinated network operating across multiple countries. This revelation transforms the Salem case from localized aberration into a component of an international conspiracy that used religious institutions as cover for ritualized cannibal activities. The question is no longer what happened in one American convent, but how many similar cells operated simultaneously across the continent. Investigators attempting to trace international connections face obstacles that transcend local pressures. Sealed Vatican archives, classified government documents, and authorities who vaguely identify themselves as ecclesiastical security protect secrets that could implicate religious institutions from multiple countries. The cover-up pattern suggests authorities knew the real extent of cannibal activities, but chose to protect institutional reputation over justice for victims. This calculated decision transformed individual crimes into undeclared state policy. Thousands of families throughout America could discover that their ancestors involuntarily participated in cannibal rituals disguised as religious services. The potential magnitude of the deception defies the psychological processing capacity of deeply Catholic societies. How many generations of the faithful took communion with human blood while praying for their soul's salvation? How many descendants carry in their DNA the chemical traces of involuntary cannibalism transmitted through mothers who never knew what they had consumed during pregnancy? The medical implications of prolonged cannibalism include transmission of specific diseases that could be genetically traced in descendant populations, but necessary studies require access to historical medical records that remain under control of the same institutions implicated in the original cover-up. Modern forensic science could definitively resolve questions about extent, methods, and victims of ritual cannibalism, but necessary samples have been destroyed, sites demolished, and documents classified under DUC security levels that transcend what's reasonable for century-old crimes. This systematic destruction of evidence isn't accidental but the result of coordinated policies to protect institutions whose survival depends on keeping hidden truths that would destroy millions of people's faith. The cost of truth is considered too high for social stability, but the cost of silence could be even greater. Each year, passing without formal investigation allows techniques used by Salem's 4 nuns to be perfected elsewhere. Historical impunity creates precedents that facilitate repetition of similar atrocities under new forms of discretion. The chalices modified by Sister Rose Mendez represent specific technology that required specialized knowledge for construction. That technology doesn't disappear. It transfers, perfects itself, and adapts to new circumstances. If ritual cannibalism techniques developed in 19th century convents remain hidden, nothing prevents their contemporary application in institutions operating under cover of religious or social respectability. The question isn't whether these practices continue, But where and under what updated forms? The small silver chalice photographed by Everett Morris before authorities confiscated all evidence remains as the only accessible visual testimony of technologies that transformed sacred objects into instruments of ritual horror. That image, reproduced at this moment by thousands of people seeking answers about their community's hidden past, could be the key to identifying similar operations continuing under new forms of institutional camouflage. How many religious objects currently in use contain similar modifications? How many apparently sacred ceremonies hide rituals that pervert faith into excuse for atrocities transcending normal human comprehension? If everyone knew but no one spoke for decades, what other secrets do institutions that still control our communities keep silenced? Share in the comments what you think about this right now, and whether you believe some traditions in your town hide truths you'd prefer not to know.